In December of 1905, a geologist named Edmund Calder trudged through knee-deep snow along a limestone ridge in northern Wyoming, 3 miles west of the small town of Delward. He was not looking for shelter. He was looking for rock samples. His boots punched through the crusted surface with each step, and the cold, 40 below with the wind, had long since stopped feeling like temperature and started feeling like intention. He almost walked past the entrance entirely. It was narrow, half hidden behind a stand of old-growth Douglas fir whose branches held snow in silence. He stepped inside out of habit, the habit of a man who had spent 20 years noting what others walked past. And then he stopped. He took out his thermometer and held it at arm's length. 51 degrees. He checked it twice. Outside, the mercury had not climbed above -24 since Tuesday. Inside this cave, in the dead of a Wyoming December, with no fire, no lamp, no living soul, 51 degrees Fahrenheit. Edmund Calder was not a man given to wonder. He had surveyed mines in Pennsylvania, limestone formations in Ohio, granite shelves in Montana. He had measured things his whole life and trusted what the numbers told him. He wrote in his field notebook that evening, by candlelight, in the careful hand of someone setting down a fact he could not yet explain. Structurally impossible by any standard I was taught. But a woman with 2 children and $47 had understood it perfectly. He noticed something else before he left. On the wooden frame beside the cold masonry stove, carved into the grain of the wood at a height of about 2 feet from the floor, 2 sets of marks. The first was careful, deliberate, cut with a knife blade by someone who was not accustomed to carving letters, but had taken their time anyway. Initials and a date. OG, December 1891. Below them, smaller, made with something thinner, a nail perhaps, was a horse. The legs were different lengths. The head was too large for the body. One ear pointed up and the other pointed sideways. A child had made it. That much was clear. What was not clear, what Edmund Calder would think about for the rest of his career, was this. The careful initials did not belong to the woman who built this place. They belonged to the man who had tried hardest to destroy her. And he had carved them in secret, in December of 1891, while still telling the whole town she was wrong. That story begins 14 years earlier, in the spring of 1891, when the Powder River took the only man Mae Sutton had ever depended on. Thomas Sutton was not a man who said much. He was steady in the way that certain men are steady, not through effort, but through nature. The way a good fence post is steady, the way a stone step holds its ground through 40 winters without being thanked for it. He fixed things before May noticed they were broken. He let their daughter Nell tally nails in his work belt while he built, teaching her numbers through the weight of iron in her small hands. He carved a wooden horse for Cal without mentioning it was a birthday gift, and Cal had galloped it across every flat surface in the house for 6 months straight. On the morning of April 14th, Thomas needed timber from the far bank of the Powder River. Spring melt had been running for 3 weeks. The river looked calm, its surface flat and bright under pale April sunlight. May stood on the bank and watched him prepare the crossing. Something about the water unsettled her. It was too smooth, too quiet, like a page laid flat to hide everything written beneath it. The Powder River had a reputation that newcomers learned too late. During spring melt, the surface could appear glassy and still while the undercurrent ran with the force of a freight train. Thomas was halfway across when it caught him. He went under without a sound. One moment he was there, waist deep, moving steadily forward. The next moment, the river closed over him like a door being shut from the other side. They found him 2 miles downstream. Mae identified him by the scar on his left forearm where a logging chain had caught him 3 years before. She buried him herself. At the graveside, after the neighbors drifted away in ones and twos, an old man made his way to Mae through the April mud. His name was Henrik Brandt. He was 78 years old, the oldest person in Delward, a man who had outlived most of the people worth talking to. He took Mae's hand. His grip was dry and certain. "Stone holds longer than wood, girl," he said. "The earth never lies about what it keeps." Mae did not understand. She thanked him and watched him walk away through the rain. But the sentence stayed. Summer passed. The women who had brought food stopped coming. The men who had offered to split wood moved on to their own wood piles. It was not cruelty. It was the arithmetic of survival in a place where everyone had enough trouble carrying their own weight. Mae worked as a seamstress, mending trousers for loggers and sewing shirts for trappers passing through. The pay was enough for flour and salt pork. It was not enough for 9 cords of firewood. She did the math one August evening at the kitchen table. $47 in the tin box. Every shirt she could sew before November. The wood pile that would last until January, maybe February if she rationed carefully. After that, nothing. That night, Nell stirred in her sleep and asked the question Mae had been afraid to hear out loud. "Mama, will we freeze like the Cutter's horse?" Every child in Delward knew about the Cutter horse. Found stiff in its stall the previous January, on a morning when the temperature had dropped past 30 below. It had become the way children in cold country spoke about the worst thing they could imagine. Mae did not answer. She pulled the blanket higher and kissed her daughter's forehead and said, "Good night." But she did not sleep. She lay in the dark for a long time, turning a single sentence over and over in her mind. The earth never lies about what it keeps. Before first light, she dressed quietly and walked west. The walk took just over an hour. She followed the deer trail along the base of the ridge, through stands of ponderosa pine, past gray outcroppings of limestone that jutted from the hillside like the knuckles of a buried fist. She was not in a rush. She was thinking. She remembered the cave. She had noticed it 2 summers before, while picking chokecherries along the ridge. A narrow opening in the limestone, facing southeast, half hidden by Douglas fir. She had stepped inside briefly, felt the cool air on her skin, and walked back out because she had berries to pick and children to feed. Now she returned with different eyes. The chamber beyond the entrance opened to nearly 20 feet across. The ceiling rose high at the center. The cave ran 40 feet deep, dry. The floor solid underfoot. Mae pressed her palm flat against the limestone. The stone was cold. Cold in August. Cold in the middle of a day when the sun had been climbing for hours. She held her hand there and felt it. Not the cold of winter, but something older, something patient. And she heard her father's voice the way you hear things said to you long ago. Not as memory, but as understanding arriving late. Rock doesn't lose heat, Mae. It just hasn't found any yet. Her father, Wilhelm Hartwell, had spent 30 years as a mining engineer in the coal fields east of Pittsburgh. He had gone into the earth thousands of times and come back up thousands of times. And what he had learned in those shafts was not only how rock behaved, but why. He understood heat the way most men understood money, as something that moved, that could be directed, that was always going somewhere, whether you intended it to or not. Mae stood in the entrance of the cave and looked at the chamber the earth had spent 10,000 years hollowing out of solid limestone. 60 feet of ancient rock on every side. Rock that did not care about wind chill or firewood prices or the opinion of neighbors. She was not looking at a hole in a hill. She was looking at 4 walls that nature had already built. All she needed to do was finish the inside. She turned and walked back down the ridge toward her children. But before she left the house that morning, she had opened the tin box to count what remained. $47. Sewing receipts. A dried flower Thomas had tucked inside as a joke on their 3rd anniversary, still holding its shape after 9 years. And beneath all of it, a letter. It was addressed in her father's handwriting to Thomas Sutton, dated the spring of 1882, the season before their wedding. Thomas had placed it in the box and never mentioned it. In 9 years of marriage, he had never said a word about it. Mae had known it was there. She had felt it under her fingers the day she packed the box after the funeral and had closed the lid quickly, the way you close a door on a room you are not yet ready to enter. She was not ready now either. She placed the money back on top of it and closed the lid. Whatever Thomas had known, whatever her father had written to him all those years ago, it would keep a little longer. The stone, after all, never lies about what it keeps. She did not tell anyone what she was planning. That was the first decision, and in some ways the most important one. Delward was a town of 43 families spread across a few square miles of river bottom and rolling grassland. A general store, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, a sawmill that operated 6 months of the year, a blacksmith, a schoolhouse where children of all ages shared a single room and a single stove that never kept the back row warm. There was no doctor. The nearest one was in Casper, 2 days by wagon in good weather and unreachable in winter. There was no telegraph office, no railroad spur. For 5 months of every year, Delward might as well have been on the moon. In a place that small, a plan announced was a plan argued over. And Mae did not have time for arguments. She had September, October, and the first 2 weeks of November before the ground froze too hard to work. 11 weeks, if she was lucky with the weather. She intended to use every one of them. She began in the last week of August, before the mornings turned cold enough to see her breath. The sawmill discarded warped and knotted lumber in a pile behind the main building. Boards too crooked to sell, too solid to rot. Mae had been walking past that pile for 3 years without seeing it. Now she saw it clearly. She borrowed a handcart from the widow Greer, who asked no questions, and began hauling boards to the ridge before sunrise, 3 loads a morning, returning home in time to start the sewing work that paid for their flour. Nell came on the 2nd day. She appeared at the cave entrance while Mae was measuring the chamber with a length of rope, and she did not ask what her mother was doing. She picked up the other end of the rope and held it steady against the far wall. That was Nell. She observed first. She committed second. Once she committed, she did not waver. Cal came too, toddling along the deer trail with his wooden horse tucked under one arm and a small bag of pebbles in his other hand. Pebbles he had been collecting all summer, chosen for their shape or their color or the particular way they fit in his palm. He arranged them in patterns on the cave floor while the women worked, narrating quiet stories to himself that neither Mae nor Nell could fully hear. This was enough. His presence was enough. The sound of his voice, even at a distance, reminded Mae why the work mattered. She framed the room 15 feet back from the entrance, where the ceiling was still high enough to stand, 14 feet long, 10 feet wide, 8 feet tall. She worked from memory and from the things her father had told her in the darkness of Pennsylvania mine shafts, when she was young enough to think that fathers knew everything, and old enough to understand that some of what they knew was worth keeping. The problem with every cabin in Delward, with every plank-walled structure she had ever lived in, was not a lack of fire. It was that heat escaped faster than fire could replace it. Flames roared up chimneys and vanished into the open sky. Thin walls gave warmth to the wind as fast as the stove could produce it. People responded by burning more wood, working harder, feeding bigger fires, never stopping to ask the question her father had taught her to ask. Where is the heat going? Stone was different. Stone absorbed heat slowly and held it stubbornly and released it gradually over hours. A cave made of limestone, surrounded on every side by 60 feet of solid rock, was a natural insulator of extraordinary power. Whatever heat you put inside would stay inside, held by millions of tons of ancient stone that did not care about blizzards or wind chill or the price of firewood. Mae built double walls of vertical planks, sealed with clay and dried moss on the inside, then 12 inches of open space, then a second wall beyond. She packed the gap with dried grass and pine needles. Trapped air, her father had told her, slowed heat transfer better than solid wood ever could. The floor came next. Flat stones laid directly on the cave floor, then a raised plank floor with a 4-inch gap beneath it. Cold air would settle into that gap and stay there. Warm air would rise and stay where people lived. She built the entrance at the back of a 5-foot vestibule with 2 doors, one after the other, with a buffer of still air between them. Cold drafts would lose most of their force before they reached the living space. And at the back wall, where the limestone ran deepest into the ridge, she planned the thing that would make all the difference. Not a fireplace, a masonry stove. She had seen one years before in the home of a German immigrant family south of Casper and had never forgotten it. The firebox was small. The fire burned fast and hot. But instead of sending all that heat straight up a chimney, the hot gases traveled through a series of channels built into surrounding stonework, giving up their warmth to the mass before finally exiting through a flue. The chimney followed a natural fissure in the cave ceiling, carefully sealed so smoke could escape, but heat could not rush out with it. Behind the stove, she mortared river stones thick against the limestone wall, building a radiant surface that would absorb heat during each burn and release it slowly through the night. 4 sources of retained warmth: the stove itself, the radiant wall, the stone floor beneath the planks, and the cave. Layers within layers, each one holding what the others gave. She was 2 weeks into the work when Owen Greer came to look. She heard him before she saw him. His boots on the rock were deliberate, unhurried, the walk of a man who has decided he is right before he has seen what he is right about. He stood at the cave entrance for a long moment, hands on his hips, and then stepped inside. Owen Greer was 47 years old, the best carpenter in Delward and the surrounding country, and he knew it the way a man knows a thing he has never had reason to question. He had built more structures in northern Wyoming than any man alive. Proper cabins, square corners, plank walls, chimneys that drew clean. When people needed a roof that would hold through winter, they came to Owen. And Owen delivered. He had earned his reputation over 20 years of honest, skilled work, and that reputation had become something more than reputation. It had become the lens through which he saw everything, including what Mae Sutton was building inside a hole in a limestone hill. He walked the length of the unfinished room without speaking. He ran his hand along the double wall framing. He crouched and examined the base where the stone floor would meet the raised planking. He stood in the location where the masonry stove would go and looked at the fissure in the ceiling with the focused skepticism of a man looking for the flaw he already knows is there. Then he turned, not to Mae, to the cave itself, to the framing, to the concept, as though Mae were an incidental detail in a conversation he was having with the structure. "Underground doesn't breathe right," he said. "Moisture collects on the stone. Mold follows. Come spring melt, water will find every crack." He paused, looked at the framing one more time. "Those children deserve a proper roof," he said, and walked out. That evening, at the general store, Owen held court. 3 men listened while he laid out his case in the calm, measured voice of a man whose authority had never been seriously challenged. An underground structure in a climate like Wyoming's. Moisture, mold, the spring melt. He ticked off each problem like items on an invoice. The men nodded. Owen's logic made sense. It always did. What Owen did not understand, what his certainty would not allow him to consider, was that someone with no formal credentials and no professional reputation might understand materials differently, might understand them better. He did not examine this possibility because it did not occur to him that it was a possibility. By the following Sunday, most of Delward had heard some version of what Owen Greer had said. The versions grew louder and less accurate with each retelling, the way gossip always does in small places. They settled eventually into a name, simple, efficient, and cruel in the particular way that small-town cruelty is cruel. Not through violence, but through dismissal. Sutton's Folly. Nell heard it first. She was at the well, filling a bucket, when Owen was speaking to a group of men near the general store steps. His voice carried. Nell stood very still with both hands on the bucket handle and listened to every word. She carried the water home without spilling a drop. She set the bucket down and looked at her mother with the flat, careful expression she reserved for difficult information. "Mr. Greer says you're putting us in danger," she said. He said it in front of Mr. Tanner and the Hollis brothers. Mae dried her hands on her apron. She looked at her daughter for a long moment. "Help me pack the clay," she said. They went back to the ridge. It was a Tuesday morning in the second week of September when Mae found the rabbit hanging from the nail beside the cave entrance. It had already been dressed and cleaned, the work of someone who knew what they were doing and had done it before the light was good. There was no note, no name, no indication of who had left it or why. She stood looking at it for a moment. Then she took it inside and made a stew. The following Tuesday, there was another one. Same nail, same careful preparation, same silence. Mae did not ask around town. She did not leave a note of her own. Some forms of generosity, she had learned, worked best when neither party acknowledged them out loud. Whoever it was understood this too. That was enough. She traded 6 weeks of sewing work for salvaged fire bricks from a collapsed forge. She mixed clay and river sand and horsehair into mortar. She built the masonry stove by hand, channel by channel, testing each joint before laying the next course of brick. The work was slow and precise, and left her hands cracked and stained with clay every evening. She did not mind. The stove was the heart of the whole design. If it failed, everything else failed with it. Nell found the piece of slate on a Thursday afternoon, half buried under the lip of the cave entrance. Gray-green, flat on one side, roughly the size of a school primer. She carried it inside and set it on the small table Mae had built from scrap lumber. "For my lessons," she said. Mae looked at her daughter, 9 years old, standing in a cave half built, holding a piece of rock like a prize, planning for school lessons while her mother was planning for survival. She turned back to the mortar she was mixing and did not say anything because she could not, quite yet, trust her voice. She moved them into the cave in the 3rd week of October. The room was finished. Walls, floor, stove, vestibule, the radiant wall of river stones mortared tight behind the firebox. Mae lit the first real fire that evening, and they sat together on the warm stone floor and watched it work. Cal pressed his palm flat against the wall after an hour, and his eyes went wide. "It's warm," he said, like the wall was doing something impossible. "That's what it's for," Nell told him, with the authority of someone who had helped build it. In the first 2 weeks, the room held between 72 and 80 degrees through the night on 2 logs a day. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 15 below. Inside, Cal slept on the warm floor without a blanket pulled over his shoulders. Nell read by candlelight until her eyes grew heavy. Mae sewed. It was the closest thing to peace she had felt since April. Jonas Aldecott had lived alone in a one-room cabin 4 miles north of Delward for 11 years, ever since his wife Marin had died of fever in the winter of 1880. He was 52 years old, lean and unhurried, with the particular quality of stillness that comes to men who spend most of their time outdoors and alone. Not the stillness of passivity, but the stillness of someone who has learned that patience is the most effective tool he owns. He came to town only when he needed salt or tobacco or a new trap spring, and he attended community events with the detached politeness of someone who has outlived most of the conversations worth having. He had noticed the smoke from the cave ridge the first week of October. He had said nothing about it to anyone. He found Scout at the edge of the Delward dumping ground on a Tuesday in early November. The dog was about 2 years old, pale gold beneath the filth, with one ear that stood straight and one that folded forward. He had been there for at least 3 days, too weak to move far, surviving on whatever scraps the wind brought in from the dump. Jonas looked at him for a long moment. The cave was closer than his cabin by 3 miles. He picked the dog up and carried him to the ridge. Nell opened the door and saw the dog in Jonas's arms and said nothing for a long moment. "Can we keep him?" she asked. Mae looked at the dog. The dog looked at Mae with the patient, assessing gaze of an animal that has learned not to expect much and is therefore not disappointed, but not yet convinced. "We barely have enough for ourselves," Mae said. "He doesn't eat much," Nell said. "He's mostly bones." Mae looked at the dog for another moment. "He's been left too," Nell said quietly. "He knows what that's like." Mae stepped aside. Scout walked into the cave, found the warmest spot on the stone floor beside the masonry stove, lowered himself onto it with the careful deliberateness of a creature making a considered decision, and exhaled so deeply and so completely that Cal, sitting 3 feet away, looked up from his pebbles and laughed. It was the first time Cal had laughed since April. Mae watched her son's face, open and bright and wholly present, the way a child's face is when something has temporarily interrupted their grief. And she felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was wound tight. Jonas nodded once at the dog, once at Mae, and left. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in November when the flue jammed. Mae woke to the smell of smoke. Not the clean, faint smell of a well-drawing stove. Thick, acrid, wrong. She was on her feet before her mind caught up with her body. In the dim glow of the dying fire, she could see smoke curling from the stove joints, filling the upper reaches of the room with a gray haze that was dropping lower by the second. The natural fissure in the cave ceiling, the one she had sealed carefully and used as her flue, was blocked. Ice, most likely. The cold outside had been brutal for days, and condensation from the flue gases had been building up. She had not yet learned to watch for this. She had seconds to decide. She grabbed the bucket of sand she kept beside the stove and smothered the fire. The flames died. The smoke stopped increasing. She cracked the outer vestibule door just inches. Cold air seeped in along the floor, dense and heavy, nudging the smoke back toward the entrance. The 2-door system worked exactly as she had designed it to work. Outer door cracked, inner door fully open, creating a slow current that moved smoke out without letting the full force of the cold rush in. 20 minutes to clear the air. 20 minutes of Cal coughing from the blankets. Nell holding a damp cloth over her brother's face, not asking questions, not crying, just doing the next necessary thing. When the smoke cleared, the fire was out. Mae wrapped both children in everything they owned, put on her coat and gloves and wool hat, took the iron rod she used for stoking, and stepped out through the vestibule into the darkness. 40 below. The stars were hard and white, and the wind moved across the ridge with a sound like something tearing. She climbed the slope by memory, searching for the fissure where her flue exited the stone. She found it by the faint smell of char. Ice had sealed it. A plug of frozen condensation built up over days and finally closed the gap completely. She swung the iron rod. The first strike sent shock up both arms. The second cracked the ice. The third broke it open. She cleared the debris with her hands because the rod was too clumsy for the final pieces, and the cold bit into her fingers with a specific, focused malice that she did not have time to think about. When she crawled back through the vestibule and reached for the matchbox, her hands would not obey. She fumbled it. Matches scattered across the floor. She gathered them in shaking fists, pressed one between her thumb and finger, tried to strike. Her hand spasmed. The match broke. Then Nell was beside her. The girl said nothing. She took her mother's shaking hands between her own small palms and held them. Just held them, pressing gently, steadily, until the trembling slowed. Then she released them, picked up a match from the floor, and struck it against the box. It did not catch. She struck again. The third match flared. Nell cupped the flame with her free hand and touched it to the kindling Mae had laid hours before. The tinder caught. The small sticks caught. The split log caught. Fire again. Mae sat on the floor beside her daughter and could not speak. She put her arm around Nell and felt the girl lean into her, 9 years old, steady as limestone. And they sat together while the stove began its work, and the room began, slowly and patiently, to remember what warmth felt like. By morning, the room was 71 degrees. The letter from the county judge arrived on a Monday in late November. A rider from the county seat brought it to the cave entrance and held it out without meeting Mae's eyes. She took it. She read it standing in the vestibule with Cal playing behind her and Nell watching from the corner of the room. Reverend Aldous, acting on concerns raised by community members, had petitioned the county judge to conduct a welfare review of the Sutton children. The judge had granted the petition. Reverend Aldous would conduct a formal inspection of the children's living situation within 3 weeks. If the Reverend determined that the conditions were unsuitable, temporary guardianship of Nell and Cal Sutton would be transferred to the Greer household pending further review. The Greer household. Owen Greer. Mae read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the tin box. She understood exactly what had happened. Owen Greer believed, genuinely, completely, without malice, that she was endangering her children. He had gone to Reverend Aldous not out of cruelty, but out of the unshakable certainty of a man who had spent 20 years building structures that worked and could not conceive that a woman with no credentials and no reputation might have built something that worked better. He was not trying to punish her. He was trying, in his own rigid way, to save Nell and Cal. That did not make it easier to hold the letter. Jonas came that evening, as he had come twice in the past week, once to leave salt without knocking, once to replace the flue cap on the exterior with a better fitted one he had made in his own shop, fitting it into place and leaving before Mae heard him on the roof. He came in now and sat in the chair that had, in recent weeks, become the chair he sat in when he came, the one nearest the stove, slightly angled toward the door, the way a man sits when he is comfortable but still keeping track of where the exit is. Mae showed him the letter without comment. He read it, set it down on the table, looked at the stove. "You know what you're doing," he said. He was not talking about the letter. He was talking about the stove, the walls, the floor, the whole of what she had built. He said it the way a craftsman recognizes another craftsman's work. Without decoration, without warmth particularly, but with the absolute conviction of someone who does not offer that recognition casually. It was the first time anyone had said it to her. She looked at the door after he left and stood there a moment in the quiet. That night, Mae sat alone. Cal was asleep. Nell's breathing had slowed and deepened on the other side of the room. The stove worked quietly behind its door. Outside, the wind moved across the ridge in long, patient sweeps. She did the calculation she had been refusing to do. If she went back to town, to a proper cabin, to visible respectability, Owen would have no grounds to pursue the petition. The children would be safe from the courts. She would lose the cave, lose the work of 3 months, lose the one thing she had built with her own hands from nothing. But the children would be safe, except they wouldn't. Not really. Not through a Wyoming winter in a cabin she couldn't afford to heat. The arithmetic of survival was as clear as the arithmetic of social pressure, and both of them were telling her the same brutal thing. She could not win. She sat with that for a long time. Then Nell moved in her sleep, turning toward the warmth of the stove, and said something low and indistinct that Mae almost did not catch. "Papa said the stone remembers." Mae did not know if Nell was dreaming or simply speaking from someplace deeper than waking. She did not know, and it did not matter. She sat with the words the way she had sat with Henrik Brandt's words at the graveside, holding them at arm's length first, and then, slowly, letting them in. She did not go anywhere. She went to sleep beside her children, and in the morning she added 2 logs to the stove and braided Nell's hair and helped Cal find the pebble he had lost behind the stove. And she kept going because there was nothing else to do, and because stopping was not something she knew how to do, and because the walls she had built were warm. Reverend Aldous arrived on a Thursday in mid-December, in the middle of the morning. He was 55, a tall man with a measured way of moving, careful with his words in the way that men are careful with words when they have spent decades aware that words carry unusual weight. He had been Delward's minister for 14 years and had learned, over those years, that most conflicts between people came not from malice, but from fear, dressed up as principle. He was not a cruel man. He was a cautious one. He had also, Mae would later understand, received a visit from Owen Greer 2 days before he came to the cave. Owen had been specific. He had named the people at the county seat he was prepared to contact. He had made clear that if Aldis's report favored Mae, the matter would not end there. Reverend Aldis had stepped inside the cave that morning, already knowing the cost of what he was about to see. He stepped through the vestibule and into the room. He stopped. The thermometer on the wall read 82 degrees. Nell sat at the small table with a book open in front of her, her coat hanging on a peg by the door, her cheeks flushed with the comfortable color of a child who has been warm for a long time. Cal sat cross-legged on the floor, arranging his pebbles into the outline of a house, narrating quietly to Scout, who lay beside him with his chin on his forepaws and his eyes moving between the boy and the Reverend with the calm attentiveness of a dog who has decided this visitor is probably not a threat. Aldis took off his coat. He was not cold. He had not been not cold indoors since October. He walked the room slowly. He pressed his palm against the double wall and felt warmth radiating from the wood. He crouched and touched the plank floor and felt warmth coming up through the boards from the stone beneath. He stood before the masonry stove and studied it, the small firebox, the sealed channel openings, the radiant wall of river stones behind it. "How much wood?" he asked. "2 logs most days," Mae said. 3 if I'm cooking something slow. He looked at the stove. The surface was calm. Not the screaming, glowing iron of an overworked box stove, but something quieter. Something that had already done its work and was holding the result. "How long does the heat last after the fire dies?" Mae opened the stove door. Faint coals glowed inside. "This fire has been burning 6 hours, she said. "I'll add 1 log before bed. The room holds above 70 until morning. If I let it go out completely, it drops to 65 and holds there. 65 degrees with no fire in a Wyoming December." Aldis looked at Nell, who had not looked up from her book. He looked at Cal, who was explaining to Scout the structural advantages of the pebble arrangement he had just completed. He looked at Mae, who was standing near the stove with her hands still and her face composed, waiting. He did not say anything for a long time. When he put his coat back on and stepped toward the vestibule, he paused with his hand on the inner door. "I will complete my report," he said, "and deliver it to the judge by Friday." He left. Mae stood in the center of the room. She did not know what he would write. She knew what he had seen. Whether those 2 things would come out the same. Whether the man who had stepped into this room would be the same man who sat down to write the report with Owen Greer's warning still in his ears, that she could not know. Scout lifted his head from the floor, watched the vestibule door for a moment, then put his chin back on his forepaws and closed his eyes. Outside, the December sky pressed low and gray over the limestone ridge. The wind moved through the Douglas fir with a sound that had begun, in recent days, to carry something in it, a particular weight, a particular edge, that Mae recognized from the barometer her father had left her, a brass instrument in a mahogany case that she had hung on the cave wall beside the thermometer. It had been falling steadily for 2 days and showed no sign of stopping, but that was a problem for another week. Tonight the stove held. The walls held. Nell read until her candle burned low. Cal fell asleep mid-sentence, his hand still resting on the pebble house he had built on the warm floor. Mae added 1 log, checked the flue, pulled the blanket up over her son's shoulders. Somewhere out on the ridge, the wind was building toward something. Inside, 78 degrees held steady, and the stone, patient and ancient and indifferent to the opinion of every man in Delward, remembered every degree it had ever been given. The report came on a Friday. Reverend Aldous delivered it himself, on foot, in the kind of gray December morning that arrives in northern Wyoming without ceremony. Sky the color of old pewter. Air so dry it cracked the skin at the corners of your mouth. Wind moving across the ridge in long, patient sweeps that took the temperature with it when it went. Mae was sewing when she heard his boots on the rock outside. Scout lifted his head from the floor, assessed the footsteps, and settled back down without growling. That was how Mae knew it was not Owen. Aldous came through the vestibule and stood in the entrance of the room with his hat in his hands. He was not a man who fidgeted, but he turned the hat slowly between his fingers as he spoke, which told Mae everything she needed to know about what the visit had cost him. He read the relevant passage from memory, in the flat, careful voice of a man reciting something he has committed to precision, because precision was the only protection he had left. The children are warm, well-fed, and properly taught. The structure, though unconventional, maintains a stable interior temperature superior to most dwellings in the surrounding area. I find no grounds for removal. Mae set down her needle. Outside, somewhere on the ridge, a Clark's nutcracker called twice and went silent. Aldous was quiet for a moment. Then he said what he had clearly come to say in addition to the report. Owen will contest it. He told me so this morning, before I filed. He's written to the county seat already. He has standing there, and he has friends. A formal hearing has been scheduled for February. Mae looked at him. I want you to understand, Aldous continued, and then stopped. Started again more carefully. I was given a version of this situation that I did not question as thoroughly as I should have. I allowed another man's certainty to substitute for my own judgment. I am not certain the February hearing will go as well as this report. Mae held his gaze. You wrote what you saw, she said. That's what I needed from you. He put his hat back on and left. Mae stood in the center of the warm room for a long time after his footsteps faded. The report was good news. The hearing in February was not. Owen Greer was not finished, and Owen Greer, when he decided something was true, was not a man who let evidence change his mind quickly. The custody threat had not ended. It had simply moved to a different room. She picked up her needle and went back to work. That evening, she opened the tin box. She had opened it many times since April, to count the money, to pay for fire bricks, to tuck away the sewing receipts that documented every dollar she had earned since Thomas died. Each time she had lifted out the coins and the receipts and the dried flour and had felt the letter beneath them and had closed the lid again.
Tonight was different.
She did not know exactly what made it different, Perhaps it was the hearing in February hanging over her like weather she could see coming but not stop. Perhaps it was the way Aldous had looked when he read the report, like a man who had done the right thing and was not entirely sure it would be enough. Perhaps it was simply that 9 months had passed since April and the grief had shifted its weight inside her, settled into something she could carry rather than something that was carrying her, and she was finally ready to read words her husband had kept from her for 9 years without asking why. She lifted out everything: the coins, the receipts, the dried flour, and then the letter. Her father's handwriting was precise and slightly formal, the hand of an engineer who had spent decades writing reports and had carried the habit into his personal correspondence. He wrote about Thomas with the careful approval of a man who did not give approval easily. He wrote about marriage in the practical terms of someone who understood that love was the beginning of a thing, not the whole of it. And then, near the end, in the same unembellished hand, he wrote this: I conducted a survey of the limestone ridge 3 miles west of the Powder River in the autumn of 1872 for a company that subsequently decided against the site. The ridge holds nothing of commercial value, but I found there a chamber I have never seen equaled in my years underground. Dry, deep, oriented southeast, with a natural fissure that would serve as a perfect flue. The thermal mass alone would hold 40 degrees of differential without any fire at all. I thought of it again last week and found myself wishing I had bought that land when I had the chance. If you ever need shelter that the earth itself will defend, Thomas, you will find it there. I suspect you will never need it, but I wanted you to know. Mae read the letter twice, then a third time. Her father had stood in that cave 19 years ago. He had understood exactly what it was. He had written it down and given it to Thomas, and Thomas had placed it in the tin box under the dried flour, and neither of them had ever said a word about it. She was not sitting in a cave she had found by accident. She was sitting in a cave her father had left her, the only way he had known how to leave it. Quietly, practically, in the form of information tucked inside a letter inside a box, waiting for the day it was needed. She had not been walking alone in the dark that August morning. She had been walking a path her father had already walked, toward a place he had already found, guided by a sentence he had spoken to her when she was 11 years old, and that she had carried without knowing she was carrying it. The stone never lies about what it keeps. She folded the letter and placed it back in the box, on top of everything else this time, where she could find it without lifting anything away. You knew, Thomas, she said to the quiet room. You knew all along. Scout raised his head, looked at her, lowered it again. The barometer fell steadily through the last week of December. Mae had hung it on the cave wall the first week she moved in, a brass aneroid barometer in a mahogany case, the kind used in mine operations to monitor atmospheric pressure. Her father had pressed it into her hands when she left Pennsylvania, along with his surveying notebooks and a set of tools she had been using to build things ever since. He had told her to trust it the way she trusted a thermometer or a level, not as a suggestion, but as a fact. She watched it now. It had been falling for 3 days. Slowly at first, the needle moving with the gentle purposefulness of something that has made up its mind and sees no reason to hurry. On the morning of January 2nd, it dropped 8 points between dawn and midday. On the morning of January 4th, it dropped 12 points in 6 hours. Mae stood in front of it for a long time without moving. Scout had not settled in 2 days. He paced the length of the room, turned, paced back, Not frantic, but persistent. The way a dog moves when something in the air has changed in a way that human senses cannot register, but animal ones cannot ignore. He lay down and then stood up again within minutes. He stationed himself at the vestibule door and then returned to the stove and then went back to the door. Cal watched him with the particular attention he gave to things he found genuinely puzzling. "Something's wrong with him," Cal said. Nell looked up from her slate. "Nothing's wrong with him," she said. "Something's wrong outside." Mae went to town. She went on foot 3 miles along the frozen ridge trail because she needed people to see her face when she told them. Not a note, not a message passed through someone else. Her face and her voice and the specific number the barometer had given her that morning. She started at the general store, where 4 men were gathered around the iron stove at the back, warming their hands. She told them what the barometer had read. She told them what she expected it to read by nightfall. She told them that in her father's experience, a 12-point drop in 6 hours preceded the kind of storm that did not give warning twice. The oldest of the 4, a rancher named Sutton, who was no relation to Thomas, listened with the polite patience of a man who intends to disagree. "Your father worked underground," he said. "Instruments read different in a mine shaft than they do up on a ridge." "He worked above ground too," Mae said. 30 years of it." "Animals and instruments don't predict weather," said the man beside him. "That's old wives' talk." "I'm not telling you what my dog thinks," Mae said. "I'm telling you what the barometer says." She went to the church next and spoke with Reverend Aldous, who listened carefully and said he would mention it at the Sunday service. Sunday was 4 days away. She went to the Crane house. Emmett Crane answered the door with Pearl on his hip. 4 years old, round-cheeked, clutching a rag doll by one arm. Mae delivered the same message she had given at the general store. Emmett nodded slowly, the nod of a man who is taking in information he is not yet sure what to do with. His wife Margaret appeared at his shoulder. Pearl held out the rag doll toward Mae with the generous impulsiveness of a child who offers her most valued possession to whoever seems to need it most. Mae touched the doll's yarn hair gently. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said. She went to 3 more households. At each one, the reception was the same: polite, attentive, and ultimately unconvinced. These were people who had survived Wyoming winters before. They had their wood piles. They had their stoves. A woman who lived in a hole in a hill reading a mining instrument did not outrank 20 years of their own experience. It was at the last house that she ran into Owen Greer. He was coming down the porch steps as she was coming up the path. They stopped a few feet apart in the January cold. His breath came in short white clouds. His eyes were steady and gave nothing away. "Mrs. Sutton, Mr. Greer," she kept her voice even. "I came to warn the Hendersons about the weather. There's a serious storm coming. I'd encourage everyone to consolidate their firewood under covered storage and move livestock into shared stalls." Owen looked at her for a long moment. He was not hostile. He was not mocking. His expression was something more complicated than either. The look of a man who is weighing something against his will and finding the weight inconvenient. "I've built through worse winters than anything that barometer has ever read," he said. It was not spoken cruelly. It was stated the way Owen stated most things. As fact, as the natural conclusion of 20 years of experience, as something he believed he was telling her for her own good. "I know you have," Mae said. "I hope that's enough." She walked back to the ridge. That evening Jonas came. He arrived as the first flakes were beginning. small and dry and sparse, the kind that do not yet look like the beginning of anything serious. He came through the vestibule and sat in his chair and accepted the cup of tea Mae poured. He wrapped both hands around it and did not drink immediately, the way a man does when he has walked a distance in the cold and the heat of the cup is doing something more urgent than the tea inside it. "How bad?" Mae asked. Jonas looked at the stove. "I came down from the North Ridge this afternoon." He paused. "The pressure up there is lower than anything I felt in 30 years. Maybe longer." He was quiet for a moment. "I've seen something like this once before. I was 19. We lost 14 cattle and 2 men that week." Mae said nothing. "I went to town," she said finally. "I know," Jonas said. He looked at the cup. "I heard." She had not expected that. She looked at him. "I came to tell you what's coming so you could be ready," he said. "Not to tell you what to do about anyone else. I'm ready. I know that too." He set down the cup and stood. At the vestibule, he paused and looked back at the room. The stove, the radiant wall, the warm floor, the 2 children asleep under their blankets. Scout watching him with calm golden eyes. "There's room," Mae said, "if it comes to that." Jonas looked at her. Then he looked at the room again, measuring something she could not quite read. He nodded once, put on his hat, and stepped out into the dark. The storm arrived on the evening of January 6th. It did not announce itself. 1 hour the sky was clear and cold and full of hard stars. The next hour the stars were gone, replaced by a darkness that was different from ordinary darkness. Thicker, closer, pressing down with a weight that you felt in your ears before you heard anything at all. Then the wind came. It did not howl, the way people who have not lived through a Wyoming blizzard imagine blizzards howl. It screamed. It was a high, sustained, living sound, a sound that did not suggest wind so much as suggest something vast and purposeful moving through the world without caring what was in its way. The Douglas fir on the ridge above the cave bent and thrashed. The sound they made was not the sound of trees and wind. It was the sound of wood under extreme stress, of living things being tested past what they were made for. Mae had banked the stove heavily that afternoon. 3 large logs, the channels packed, the radiant wall already holding 2 days of accumulated warmth. She had filled every container in the cave with water from the spring seep at the back of the chamber, a slow and constant weeping of groundwater through limestone that never froze, never varied, emerging at 48 degrees, regardless of what the world above was doing. The temperature outside dropped to 23 below in the first 2 hours. By midnight it was 38 below, and still falling. Mae knew this because Jonas had left her a second thermometer the previous week, an outdoor one mounted in the vestibule on the outer wall, without comment or instruction. She had understood immediately what it was for. Inside, 78 degrees. She did not sleep. She sat with her back against the warm wall and listened to the storm work on the ridge above her, and she thought about the families in Delward burning through their wood at twice the rate they had planned for, and she thought about chimney mortar and what years of freeze and thaw did to it, and she thought about Pearl Crane and the rag doll offered to a stranger, and she thought about Emmett's slow nod that had not quite become a decision. Cal woke suddenly at 1:30, sat straight up, and turned his head toward the vestibule with the alert, focused expression of a child listening for something specific. "Mama!" Mae was beside him in 2 steps. "Someone's outside," he said. Scout was already at the vestibule door, not growling, not aggressive, standing squarely in front of it with his tail still and his ears forward. Waiting. Mae put on her coat and opened the inner door. Through the outer door she could hear nothing over the storm. But Scout pressed forward, certain, and Mae opened the outer door against the force of the wind and looked out into the darkness. Reverend Aldous stood 2 feet from the entrance. His coat was sheeted with ice. His hat was gone. His face, in the dim light that spilled through the open door, was the grayish white of a man who has been outside in this for long enough that his body has begun making decisions about what it can afford to keep warm. He could not speak. His jaw was moving, but the muscles had stiffened past the point of easy use. Mae stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "Close the outer door behind you." He managed the door. He stood in the vestibule for a moment, and then Mae opened the inner door, and the warmth hit him, the way warmth hits a person who has been without it long enough to forget what it feels like a physical force, like something pushing back against the cold that had settled into his bones over 3 miles of open ridge trail in a screaming January blizzard. He made a sound, not a word, something lower than a word. Mae guided him to the chair by the stove. She put water in the tin pot and set it to warm. Nell was sitting up in her blankets, watching with the calm, collected expression of a child who has learned that crises are managed rather than survived. "Nell," Mae said, "the extra blanket." Nell had it around the Reverend's shoulders before Mae finished the sentence. It took 20 minutes for Aldous to speak. When he could, he said, "The church lost both windows on the north face. The Henderson barn roof is down. I don't know about the rest. How did you get here?" "The Ridge Trail. I've walked it before." He paused. I remembered where it was. Mae handed him the warmed water. He held the cup in both hands and did not drink immediately, just held it, letting the heat move from the tin into his palms, and from his palms into the rest of him. "I should have listened to you," he said. "Drink the water, Reverend." Mrs. Sutton. "The water," she said. "We can talk when you're warm." He drank. He was not the last to arrive that night. An hour after Aldous, the outer door sounded again. Mae opened it to find the Crane family, all 6 of them, clustered in the entrance. They had come and borrowed blankets pressed on them by neighbors, still in their nightclothes beneath. Emmett Crane looked at Mae with the expression of a man whose face has finished pretending. "Our cabin's gone," he said. The chimney went first. Mae looked past him at his wife Margaret, at the 3 older children shivering in the vestibule, at Pearl in Emmett's arms wrapped in 2 blankets, her face buried in his neck. "Come in," Mae said, "all of you." As Emmett carried Pearl past her, Mae saw the feet, the particular white-gray color at the toes that she recognized from her father's descriptions of cold injury in the mines. Tissue that had been without circulation long enough for damage to begin. She said nothing about it. There was nothing useful to say about it yet. What the feet needed right now was warmth, applied slowly and correctly. Everything else was a problem for after the storm. Sigrid and Oscar Thorne arrived 40 minutes later, their sod house having taken on water through the roof when the weight of new snow collapsed a section of it. Sigrid came through the door with ice in her eyebrows and stopped when she felt the warmth and stood very still for a moment with her eyes closed. "God," she said softly, in a way that was not profanity. Vera Calloway came alone, an hour before dawn. She stood in the vestibule and looked at Mae and opened her mouth and then closed it again. Mae stepped aside and Vera came in and found a space along the wall and sat down and did not speak for a long time. 2 young men from the south end of town arrived with a third between them. Fletcher Hale, 17 years old, conscious but moving in the slow, deliberate way of someone whose body is making decisions without consulting his mind. Mae sat him near the stove and had Nell bring the extra blanket. She worked through the arrivals with the focused efficiency of someone who had already thought about this problem in the abstract, on the quiet nights when the storm was still just a number on a barometer and a feeling in the air. She organized blankets and floor space. She heated water in the tin pot and the cast iron pan, because warm water was what the cold injured needed, not hot, warm, the specific temperature her father had taught her from his years in the mines. Hot water on frostbitten flesh caused more damage than the cold had. Warm water, slow rewarming, patience. She had been working for 2 hours when the final knock came. It came at 4:30 in the morning, while 16 people were arranged across the floor of the cave in various states of exhaustion and recovery. Mae heard it over the storm because she had been listening for it, though she could not have said exactly why. She opened the outer vestibule door. Owen Greer stood in the entrance. His coat was dry. His hat was on. He was not injured. He was not in distress in the way the others had been in distress. Blue-lipped, ice-covered, past the point of pride. His house, she would learn later, had held through the night. His woodpile was adequate. He had no physical reason to be standing at her door at 4:30 in the morning in the worst blizzard in 40 years. He was there because every other person in Delward had come here, and he was the only one who had not. And whatever Owen Greer was, certain, rigid, immovable in his convictions, he was not a man who could stand alone in a warm house knowing that the entire rest of his town was sheltering in a place he had spent 4 months calling a folly. He stood in the entrance and looked at her, said nothing. In the dim light, she could see his jaw working slightly, the same involuntary motion she had seen in Aldous, though in Owen's case, it was not cold that had stiffened his face, but something else entirely. Mae looked at him. The man who had given her children's names to a county judge, the man whose certainty had nearly taken Nell and Cal from her, the man who had called this place a folly in front of witnesses and filed paperwork to prove it, and had not once in 4 months considered the possibility that he might be wrong. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. "Come in, Mr. Greer," she said. Owen stepped through the vestibule and into the room. He stopped just inside the inner door. He did not speak. He looked at the stove, at the radiant wall behind it, at the floor, at the thermometer on the wall reading 72 degrees. He looked at the 16 people arranged across the warm floor. Neighbors, families, a reverend, 2 young men holding a third upright, a 4-year-old girl with her feet wrapped in cloth near the stove. He found the darkest corner of the room and sat down in it. He did not speak again that night. Outside, the storm continued its work on the world. The wind did not soften. The temperature did not climb. Somewhere in Delward, 3 structures had already failed. The crane chimney, the Henderson barn roof, the 2 north windows of the church. By morning, there would be more. Inside the cave, Mae Sutton had built from salvaged lumber and clay, and a principle her father had pressed into her understanding. Before she was old enough to know it was unusual for a girl to be taught such things, 19 people breathed in the particular rhythm of the exhausted and the frightened and the slowly warming. 72 degrees held steady, and the stone, as it had always done, remembered every degree it had ever been given. Dawn came without color. The sky beyond the cave entrance lightened from black to a gray so pale it was almost white, and the storm did not soften with it. The wind continued its work on the ridge above, and the snow drove sideways past the entrance in sheets that made the Douglas fir invisible from 10 feet away. But the light changed, and the change was enough. The people on the floor began to stir. Mae had not slept. She had sat through the night with her back against the warm wall, adding logs at intervals she had calculated by feel rather than clock, managing the stove the way her father had managed his mine shafts, with continuous small corrections rather than large interventions, with the understanding that consistency was more valuable than intensity. The room had held between 71 and 76 degrees through the coldest hours. The stove had asked for nothing dramatic in return. She rose at first light and began the work of morning. 19 people in a space built for 3 required a particular kind of organization, not rigid, not managed with authority, but shaped quietly from the inside, the way a good stove shapes the temperature of a room without announcing itself. Mae moved among the waking bodies with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had decided in the long hours of the night exactly what needed to be done and in what order. Water first. She heated the tin pot and the cast iron pan simultaneously, filling them from the spring seep at the back of the cave, the slow, constant weeping of groundwater through limestone that never froze, never varied, emerging at 48 degrees, regardless of what January was doing above it. Heated to just above body temperature, it was exactly what the cold injured needed, and there were 3 of them she was watching closely. Fletcher Hale, whose hands had been a waxy yellow when he arrived and had begun moving toward pink in the night. Pearl Crane, whose feet she had rewrapped twice already, and an older man named Corwin, whose left ear had gone white on the walk to the cave and had not yet fully returned to color. She checked Fletcher first. His color had improved. She filled the extra basin she used for washing with warm water and had one of the young men who had brought him hold Fletcher's hands in it for 20 minutes. The boy was conscious and embarrassed about it, which Mae took as a good sign. People who were embarrassed were generally not in immediate danger. Pearl was harder. Emmett had not slept either. He sat against the wall with his daughter in his arms, in the same position Mae had last seen him at midnight, his face holding the careful blankness of a man keeping himself together through force of will because falling apart was not useful to the person who needed him. Pearl was awake, watching the room with large, quiet eyes. Mae knelt beside them. She looked at Pearl's face first and spoke directly to her, the way she had learned children needed to be spoken to when they were frightened. "Good morning," she said. "You slept well." It was not a question. Pearl considered it for a moment with the seriousness of a 4-year-old taking in information. "I had a dream," Pearl said. Her voice was small but steady. "Scout was in it." "He has that effect," Mae said. She examined the feet carefully, with the experience of a woman who had read her father's mining reports on cold injury and committed the relevant sections to memory as practical knowledge to be stored against the day it was needed. What she found was consistent with what she had seen in the night. The 2 smallest toes on Pearl's left foot were still without sensation, the tissue firm and pale in a way that meant the damage had gone deeper than the surface. She rewrapped them without changing her expression, kept her hands steady, kept her movements slow and deliberate. Emmett watched her work. He said nothing for a long time. Then quietly, "How bad?" Mae met his eyes. "She needs a doctor when the storm breaks," she said. "She's warm now. That's what matters today." Emmett nodded. His jaw worked. He nodded again. Sigrid Thorne appeared at Mae's elbow while she was banking the stove for the mid-morning burn. Sigrid was 43, a compact and capable woman who had homesteaded in Wyoming for 11 years and had the particular quality of practical competence that comes to women who have been solving problems without resources for longer than seems reasonable. "What do you need?" she said. "Not what can I do. What do you need?" The question of someone who understands that efficiency matters more than comfort in a crisis. Mae looked at her. "Water rotation," she said. "Keep the pot warm. Refill from the back seep when it gets below half. Don't let it boil. And the children need something to do when they wake up properly. It keeps them from frightening each other." Sigrid looked across the room at Nell, who was already awake and had positioned herself on the floor near the youngest Crane boy, Warren, 6 years old, who had woken from sleep directly into confusion and was working his way toward tears. Nell had her collection of small stones spread between them on the warm floor. She was teaching Warren to sort them by weight, demonstrating the method with the focused patience of someone who has been taught that knowledge is the best thing you can give a frightened person because it gives them something to do with their hands. Warren was not crying. He was sorting stones. Sigrid turned back to Mae without a word and went to the water pot. The day organized itself around necessity. People who were whole enough to help were put to use helping because purposeful motion generated warmth, and because people who are helping do not have time to panic. Sigrid managed the water. Oscar Thorne checked the vestibule seals at intervals. The 2 young men who had brought Fletcher took turns watching him, keeping him awake and talking, feeding him small amounts of warm water at regular intervals. Reverend Aldous, recovered enough by midday to be useful, sat with Emmett Crane for a long time without speaking, and then said something quietly that Mae could not hear, and she did not need to hear it. The quality of Emmett's stillness changed. Not better exactly, but less alone. Owen Greer sat in his corner and said nothing. He was not idle. Mae noticed this without drawing attention to it. He watched the stove. He watched the wall. He watched the floor where the heat came up through the planks from the stone beneath. He was doing what a craftsman does when he encounters something he does not yet understand. He was taking it apart with his eyes, tracing the logic of it, following the heat the way a carpenter follows the grain of the wood. She had seen her father do the same thing in mine shafts he had not designed, working out why something had been built the way it had been built before. Deciding whether it was right. She said nothing about it. She let him look. The moment with Pearl happened in the late afternoon. The girl had been quiet all day, not distressed, not frightened, but contained in the way of a child who is processing something too large for her current vocabulary. She had eaten the thin porridge Mae made from the grain she kept in the cave storage. She had watched the room with her serious eyes. She had allowed herself to be held by her father and her mother in turns. Scout had stayed close to the Crane family all day, not performing comfort, simply present the way he was always simply present, his body available, his warmth available, his calm available to whoever needed it. In the late afternoon, he lay down beside Pearl, who was propped against the cave wall with her feet wrapped and her hands loose in her lap. The room had quieted. Most of the adults were resting. Aldous was asleep sitting up. The Thorne children were asleep against their mother. Emmett had his eyes closed. Pearl looked at Scout for a long time. Then she moved her hand from her lap and placed it on his side, careful, tentative, as though she was not entirely sure of her welcome. Scout breathed. Pearl's hand rose and fell with him. She looked at her hand for a moment. Then she looked up and found Mae across the room, and she said, in a voice that was not quite a whisper, "Is he cold, too?" The room, without having been loud, became quieter. Mae looked at the girl. "Not anymore," she said. "He was cold once. Now he lives here." Pearl considered this. Her hand continued to move slowly with Scout's breathing. "I'm going to get a dog," she said. It was not a question. It was a decision, stated with the quiet finality of a 4-year-old who has made up her mind. "I think that's a good plan," Mae said. Something broke in Emmett Crane's face. Not dramatically, not with sound, just a quiet release of the control he had been maintaining since midnight, a loosening across his jaw and around his eyes that he turned away to manage, pressing his face briefly into his wife's hair, his shoulders moving once and then going still. Margaret put her hand on his back. Nobody mentioned it. That was how it was handled, with the dignity of pretending not to notice what needed to remain private, and the grace of staying close enough to be felt. It was after the children slept that Vera Calloway came to sit beside Mae at the stove. She had spent most of the day doing the small, useful things that came to hand, holding a child while its mother slept, keeping a water cup filled, passing blankets, without speaking to anyone directly. Now she came and sat and looked at the stove for a long time before she spoke. "I should have come back," she said. Mae stirred the coals with the iron rod. "I was afraid of what people would think," Vera continued, after Owen started talking. "I knew it wasn't right when I was doing it. I did it anyway." She stopped. "I chose convenient over kind, and I knew I was doing it. And that's the part I can't." She stopped again. Mae set down the iron rod. She looked at her friend, at the face she had sat across from on Sunday afternoons, at the eyes that were earnest and ashamed in equal measure, and not trying to hide either. "You're here now," Mae said. It was not absolution. It was not quite forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. The recognition that what a person does in the difficult moment matters more than what they failed to do in the comfortable one. Mae was not ready to forgive the months of silence yet, and she was not going to pretend she was. But Vera was here, in the storm, in the cave, and that was real, and it counted for something. Vera nodded. She went back to the water rotation without another word, and she worked steadily until dark. It was near midnight when Jonas came and crouched beside Mae at the stove. He had been there all day, present in the background the way he was always present, doing the physical work that needed doing without being asked, refilling the water buckets from the back seep, repositioning people's belongings so the floor space made more sense, checking the vestibule doors at intervals to make sure the seals were holding. He had not drawn attention to any of it. Now he crouched beside her in the stove light, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him separate from the warmth of the room, and he watched her hands adjust the channel draw. "Fletcher's going to be all right," he said quietly. "His color's been good since noon." "I know." Jonas was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm was still working, though with slightly less of the screaming quality it had carried through the night before. Less voice, more weight. The difference between a thing announcing itself and a thing settling in for the duration. "Someone fixed your east channel joint," Jonas said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the stove. 2 weeks ago, before the storm. I noticed it when I replaced the flue cap. The mortar was fresh. He paused. That joint would have failed in this kind of sustained burn. It would have cracked by the second night. You'd have lost 1/4 of your draw. Mae looked at the stove. "Who?" she said. though she had already begun to understand. Jonas was quiet for a moment. Then he looked across the room toward the dark corner where Owen Greer sat with his back against the cave wall, eyes closed, hands folded in his lap. He said nothing more. He did not need to. Mae looked at Owen for a long time. The man who had come to this cave in September and told it, not her, the cave, that the children deserved a proper roof. The man who had gone to Reverend Aldous and set a legal process in motion that was still unresolved, still waiting in February with its paperwork and its county seat contacts, and its threat that had not gone away. The man who sat in the darkest corner of the room he had spent 4 months calling a folly, watching its stove with the eyes of a craftsman who has found something he cannot argue with, and who had come back, alone, in secret, in December, when she was in town and the children were elsewhere, and fixed the joint that would have failed, not to help her. She did not think it was that simple. She thought it was something older and less comfortable than help. The inability of a man who understands materials to walk away from a flaw he knows how to correct, even when the structure belongs to someone he is actively working against, even when fixing it meant admitting in the only language he had that the structure was worth fixing. Two things living in the same person at the same time. The lawsuit and the mortar. The certainty and the repair. Both of them real. She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at the stove. Jonas's hand was on the floor between them. Not reaching, not placed deliberately, just resting, open, the way a person's hand rests when they are not guarding anything. Mae looked at it for a moment. Then she placed her own hand beside it, close enough to feel the warmth, not quite touching. They stayed that way for a while. The stove worked quietly. The people on the floor breathed in the steady rhythm of exhausted sleep. Cal, who had been asleep against the wall for 2 hours, chose this particular moment to open his eyes. He looked across the room at his mother and Jonas with the frank, unguarded attention of a 5-year-old who has not yet learned to pretend he does not notice things. He looked at them for a moment. "Jonas stays," he said to no one in particular. He closed his eyes and went back to sleep. Jonas looked at the wall in front of him. After a moment, the corner of his mouth moved. Mae looked at the stove. "He does say what he means," she said. "He does," Jonas agreed. The fever broke just before dawn. Mae had been checking Cal through the night, not urgently, not with the focused fear she had carried through the flu incident in November, but with the steady watchfulness of a mother who has learned to monitor without alarming. He had run warm since the second day of the storm, not dangerously so, but enough that she had kept him close to the stove, and had not let herself stop paying attention. At some point in the last hour before light, she placed her hand on his forehead and found it cool, damp with the particular sweat of a fever releasing rather than building. She sat with her hand there for a long time without moving, feeling the coolness spread under her palm, feeling the steadiness of his breathing beneath it. She did not cry. She had learned in the months since April that the moments when you most need to cry are often the moments when your body simply does not have it to spare. She sat with her hand on her son's forehead and breathed, and that was enough. An hour later, as the gray light was beginning at the cave entrance, a sound came from the far end of the room that brought everyone who was still awake to full attention. Margaret Crane, who had been laboring quietly since 3 a.m. with Sigrid beside her and Mae checking in at intervals, delivered a daughter in the warmth of the cave as the storm finally, slowly, grudgingly, with several false endings, began to ease. The baby announced herself with the particular outrage of a new person encountering cold air for the first time and finding it entirely unacceptable. The sound she made was thin and fierce and absolutely alive, and it moved through the room the way sound moves through a small space full of people who have been afraid for a long time, cutting through everything, landing in the chest, doing something to the air that had not been done to it in 36 hours. Pearl, who had been dozing against her father's arm, opened her eyes at the sound. She listened for a moment. "Is that a baby?" she asked. "It is," Emmett said, his voice slightly unsteady. Pearl considered this with great seriousness. Then, "Is it ours?" Emmett laughed. It was the first time anyone in the room had laughed since the storm began, and several people who had not known how close they were to tears discovered it at that moment. "It belongs to Mr. and Mrs. Crane," Mae said, appearing beside them. "Your mother just worked very hard." Pearl looked at the baby being wrapped in the warmest cloth Mae owned, her face serious and evaluating. Then she looked at Scout. "He should meet it," Pearl said. "Later," Mae said, "when it's warmer." Pearl accepted this and lay back against her father's arm. Emmett and Margaret named the baby Stone, not Hope, which was what people in stories named babies born in storms. Stone, because Margaret had spent 3 days pressing her back against a warm wall and understanding, in the way you understand things when you are beyond thinking and operating entirely on sensation, that what had kept them alive was not luck or miracle, but mass. Patient, accumulated, unhurried mass that had absorbed everything given to it and held it without complaint until it was needed. They named her Stone because the stone had held. Mae stood at the edge of the small crowd gathered around Margaret and the baby and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. Not peace exactly. Peace was something you arrived at, and she had not arrived anywhere yet. But the early sense of it, the intimation that arrival was possible. Outside, the wind had dropped to half its force. The screaming quality was gone. What remained was weight, steady, gray, still substantial, but no longer the sound of something trying to tear the world apart. Just winter, doing what winter does, at a volume that could be managed. Inside, the thermometer read 73 degrees. Mae added 1 log to the stove. She checked the vestibule seal. She straightened the blanket across Pearl's shoulders without waking her. Then she sat back against the warm wall and looked at the 19 people arranged across the floor of the cave she had built. And the 20th, brand new, making the small adjustive sounds of someone just beginning to figure out what breathing was for. Cal stirred beside her. He opened his eyes, looked around the room, looked at his mother. "Are these our people now, Mama?" he asked. He asked it the way he asked most things, simply without self-consciousness, as though the answer were obvious and he was just confirming it. Mae looked around the cave, at Aldous, asleep sitting up, at Emmett and his family, all of them now, Pearl and Warren and the 2 older children, and Margaret and the baby named Stone, at Vera, who had stayed and worked all day without being asked again, at the Thorne family, who would rebuild their house in the spring, at Fletcher Hale, 17 years old, whose hands had come back to pink by noon, and who would tell this story for the rest of his life, at Jonas, whose hand had been close to hers on the floor, at Owen Greer in his corner, who had fixed a joint in secret and sat in silence and had not left, at Nell, asleep with her slate still in her lap, her hand resting on the lessons she had been teaching Warren Crane all afternoon. "Yes, Cal," she said, "I think they are." He nodded, the nod of a child who has had something confirmed that he already knew, and lay back down. Within 2 minutes, he was breathing the deep, absolute breath of a child who has no doubt about where he is or whether he is safe. Mae added nothing more to the stove. It did not need it. She sat in the warmth her father had imagined, in the cave her father had found, in the life she had built from salvaged lumber and clay and the patient logic of stone, and she listened to the breathing of 20 people and the easing of the storm outside, and she let the warmth hold her the way it had held everything she had put into it, without drama, without condition, without end. The world the storm left behind was unrecognizable. 8-foot drifts had buried the deer trail entirely. The choke cherry bushes along the ridge were gone beneath the surface, reduced to faint suggestions of shape under smooth white. 3 miles east, Delward sent up a handful of thin smoke plumes into the crystalline January air, fewer than there should have been, and quieter, the smoke of fires running on the last of what people had. Mae organized the return the way she had organized everything inside the cave, without announcement, by deciding what needed to happen and beginning to make it happen. Jonas and Oscar Thorne went first, breaking trail through the drifts with the deliberate efficiency of men who understood that the goal was not speed, but arriving. They came back an hour later for the next group. By midday, the cave held only Mae's family, Jonas, and Owen Greer, who had waited without being asked to wait, and without explaining why. Emmett Crane carried Pearl the full 3 miles. He did not put her down once. Scout walked beside them for the first quarter mile, matching Emmett's pace exactly, and then turned back when Mae whistled, sitting at the cave entrance, watching until the Crane family crested the first rise and disappeared. Mae stood at the entrance until they were gone. She already knew what the doctor and Casper would find when the road cleared enough for a wagon. She had known since the first night, when she had unwrapped Pearl's feet in the warmth of the cave and seen the color that did not come back the way the other colors came back. She had said nothing about it then because there was nothing useful to say, and she said nothing about it now for the same reason, but she felt it. The specific weight of a harm that did not have to happen. 4 minutes in the snow outside a burning cabin. A warning delivered to that door 4 days before the storm, received with the polite patience of people who had already decided they knew more than she did. She would carry it the way you carry the things you could not prevent, not on the surface where it would claim too much attention, but underneath where it did its quiet work of keeping you honest. She went back inside and cleaned. The town came to her in the week that followed, not in a group, but in a stream, ones and twos, arriving on the ridge trail with the careful expressions of people approaching a conversation they have prepared for and are no longer entirely sure they prepared correctly. Reverend Aldous held a town meeting on the 3rd day after the storm, in the church with its 2 north windows boarded over with scrap lumber. He stood before the 43 families of Delward and said what he had to say. He had been wrong. He had allowed himself to be persuaded by a confident voice when he should have looked with his own eyes. He had very nearly used the authority of his office to separate a mother from her children on the basis of a judgment that 3 days of 72-degree warmth had made definitively false. He was sorry, not in the drifting general way that public apologies drift, but specifically naming what he had done and what it had cost and what he intended to do differently. The room was quiet when he finished. Then Emmett Crane, sitting in the 3rd row with his wife and his children, stood up. He said that his family owed Mae Sutton their lives, and that he intended to say so wherever and whenever it was relevant, and that he considered the matter of her judgment and her competence to be settled. He sat back down. Delward did not burst into applause. It was not that kind of town, and this was not that kind of moment. But something in the room shifted. The almost physical sensation of a collective opinion releasing its grip on a position it had been holding past the point of evidence. The February hearing was canceled the following week. The letter from the county seat was brief and administrative, the language of bureaucracy stepping back from something it no longer had grounds to pursue. Mae read it standing in the vestibule of the cave, and then placed it in the tin box beside her father's letter. Mae was not at the town meeting. She was at the cave, cleaning. Sigrid Thorne came to the ridge 5 days after the storm with her husband and a pot of venison stew and an expression of focused purpose that Mae had come to recognize as Sigrid's baseline mode of operation. She set the stew down. She looked around the room, at the walls, the floor, the stove, the vestibule. She had spent 3 days inside this space. She had felt the warmth come up through the floor planks and radiate from the wall when she pressed her back against it. "I want to learn how you built it," she said. "All of it. Not to copy the shape, to understand why it works." "Sit down," Mae said. "This will take a while." They sat at the small table, and Mae drew on a piece of slate with charcoal, cross-sections, diagrams, the path of hot gases through the masonry channels, the principle of cold air settlement below the raised floor. She explained the double wall and why the gap mattered more than the thickness. She explained thermal mass the way her father had explained it to her, starting with the question rather than the answer, trusting that a person who understands why something works will always know what to do with the knowledge. Sigrid asked questions that were precise and practical, and never the same question twice. Oscar made his own marks on a separate piece of slate. They stayed 3 hours. When they left, Sigrid paused at the vestibule and turned back. "My husband," she said, and then stopped. Started again. "He has been afraid every winter for 11 years. He never said so. But I knew." She paused. "You took that away from him. A man should be able to sit in his own house in January without being afraid of what January will do to it." She left. Mae stood in the vestibule for a moment after Sigrid's footsteps faded. Then she went back inside and added a log to the stove because it needed one. Corwin, the older man whose left ear had gone white on the walk to the cave, recovered fully. He was the first person in Delward to ask Mae to draw him the diagrams of the masonry stove. Not because he intended to build one, but because he wanted to understand how something could hold that much warmth without seeming to try. He sat at the small table for 2 hours, asking questions in the careful way of someone who has spent a long time being wrong about something and is now determined to understand it correctly. Owen Greer came on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the storm. He came alone, without announcing himself, in the middle of the morning. Mae heard his boots on the rock, the same deliberate, unhurried walk she had heard the first time, in September, when he had come to tell the cave it was wrong. She did not go to the entrance. She waited. He came through the vestibule and stood in the room. He was wearing the same coat he always wore, his hat in his hands. He walked the length of the room the way he had walked it the first time, running his hand along the double wall, crouching at the base where the stone floor met the raised planking, standing before the masonry stove. But the quality of his attention was different now. The first time he had been looking for flaws. This time he was looking at the thing itself, trying to understand how it worked. the way a craftsman looks at another craftsman's work when the pretense that it might not be good work has become unsustainable. He asked questions, precise, technical, carpenter's questions, the depth of the flue channels, the mortar composition for the radiant wall, the angle of the vestibule relative to the prevailing wind direction. Mae answered each one directly and completely, without editorializing, without satisfaction or resentment. He was asking. She was answering. That was what was happening. He spent 20 minutes in the room. Before he left, he stopped at the double wall and pressed his palm flat against it. The same gesture Mae had seen him make in September. But this time, he held it there longer, and his hand was still instead of exploratory. The gesture of a craftsman acknowledging craft. He turned toward the vestibule. The channels, he said, I would have run them shallower. He left. Mae stood in the center of the room for a moment. She had not expected an apology. She had not received one. What she had received was Owen Greer walking through her door and asking her questions and listening to the answers. And for a man of his particular architecture, she understood that this was the closest thing to an apology he had. She moved out of the cave in the first week of March. The new house was modest. 1 story, 2 rooms, stone floor in the kitchen, thick walls, masonry stove with channels she had designed herself, a vestibule that faced away from the prevailing wind. The warmest structure in Delward, though she did not say so. People would figure it out in November. Jonas had helped her build it in the weeks after the storm, working alongside her in the way he worked alongside everything, without drawing attention to the work, focused entirely on doing it correctly. He had opinions about the porch. He expressed them once, specifically, and then let her decide. East side, he said, better morning light. She had thought about it for a day. Then she had said yes. On her last morning in the cave, Mae did a final pass through the room, checking the corners, the shelf, the space beneath the raised floor where Cal had once lost his red pebble. She was almost finished when she crouched beside the masonry stove to check the base seals one last time. She found them at a height of about 2 feet from the floor on the wooden frame beside the stove. The first set was carved with a knife blade, in careful letters cut by someone who was not accustomed to carving, but had taken their time anyway. 2 initials and a date. OG, December 1891. Below them, smaller, made with something thin, a nail, she thought, was a horse. The legs were different lengths. The head was too large for the body. 1 ear pointed up and the other pointed sideways. Mae sat back on her heels and looked at them for a long time. December 1891. Before the storm. Before the hearing was canceled. In the weeks when Owen Greer was still speaking against her at the general store and had already written to the county seat and still believed, as completely as he had ever believed anything, that she was endangering her children. He had come to the cave. When she was in town and the children were elsewhere, he had come alone and walked through the vestibule and into the room she had built and gone to the stove. And done what a craftsman does when he finds a flaw in something he cannot bring himself to leave flawed. He had fixed it. The east channel joint that Jonas had noticed. The repair that had held through 3 days of sustained burn in the coldest storm in 40 years. And he had carved his initials beside it, the way a craftsman signs his work. Not to claim credit. She did not think it was that. She thought it was something more like acknowledgement, the only form of it available to a man who could not yet bring himself to acknowledge it any other way. and below his initials, Cal's horse. Cal, who was 5 years old and drew horses on every flat surface he encountered, who had been in this room every day for months, playing with his pebbles on the warm floor while his mother worked the mortar joints, who had found the wooden frame and done with it what he did with every wooden frame he found, and had no idea that someone else had been there first. Two people who had never met in this room. The man who had tried hardest to take this place from her, and the child who had been kept warm inside it. Both of them leaving marks on the same piece of wood, neither knowing about the other. Mae looked at the horse for a long time. The legs that were different lengths, the ear that pointed sideways. She had seen Cal draw this horse 100 times, on scraps of paper, on the margins of Nell's slate, on the dirt outside the cave entrance with a stick. She knew every wrong proportion of it. She did not know what to make of Owen's initials beside it. She was not sure she needed to. Some things did not require a conclusion to be true. The initials were there. The horse was there. The joint had held. 3 days at 72 degrees with 19 people inside, and the joint had held. She stood. She took the tin box from the shelf, the tin box that held the February letter, and the fire brick receipts, and the dried flour Thomas had tucked in as a joke, and her father's letter that had waited 9 years to be read. She opened it and took out her father's letter and held it for a moment. Then she placed it on the shelf beside the stove, where it could be found by whoever came next. Trappers used this ridge. Jonas had said so. In winter, when the cold came down from the north with the particular intention of this particular cold, someone would find this entrance and step inside and feel the 51 degrees and not understand what they were feeling. Her father had wanted the knowledge passed on. This was one way to pass it. She closed the tin box and walked through the vestibule and out onto the ridge. It was March. The snow was retreating from the south-facing slopes. Small brown patches of last year's grass were visible at the base of the limestone outcroppings, and the choke cherry bushes showed the first faint red of new growth along their stems. The Douglas fir stood still in air that carried, for the first time since October, something that might eventually become warmth. She did not look back at the cave entrance. She did not need to. It would be there when the next person needed it. That was what she had built it for, even if she had not known that when she started. She walked down the ridge toward the wagon road where Jonas was waiting with the cart. He was leaning against it with his hat pushed back, watching the ridge. And when she came down the trail with the last of her things, he straightened and took the bundle from her without asking if she needed him to. "That everything?" he said. "That's everything." He looked up at the cave entrance, half visible through the Douglas fir. Then he looked at her. "The porch," he said. "I was thinking this morning, if we angle it just slightly south on the east end, it'll catch the light until past 8 in July." Mae considered this. She looked at the ridge. She looked at the wagon road. "Show me when we get there," she said. He nodded, and they walked together toward town. The porch went up that spring on the east side of the new house, angled exactly as Jonas had suggested. It caught the morning light the way he had promised, long and gold, arriving before the rest of the day had made up its mind about what it intended to be. Mae sat on it most mornings before the children woke, watching the ridge to the west, where the Douglas fir stood above the limestone in the early light. The knowledge spread the way her father had always said practical knowledge spread, not through argument or announcement, but through results. By the summer of 1893, 9 structures within 20 miles reflected the principle she had demonstrated. By 1897, the number was closer to 35. Nobody called it a system. People simply said that the Thorn place stayed warm now, or that the new schoolhouse, redesigned at Aldous' insistence, was the first building in Delward where the children in the back row took their coats off. Owen built 11 more structures in the years that followed. Everyone had double walls. Everyone had a stone floor in the main room. Everyone had a masonry stove with channels long enough to do the work they were meant to do. His clients praised him for it. He accepted the praise with a nod and said nothing else. He never said her name, but the walls said it for him, to everyone who was warm inside them. Pearl Crane reached Casper 2 days after the storm, when the road was passable enough for a wagon. The doctors did what doctors in 1892 could do. It was not nothing. The smallest toe on her left foot did not survive the 4 minutes in the snow outside the burning cabin. She would walk without a limp. She would grow up to be the kind of person who notices when other people are cold and does something about it before they have to ask. Mae never spoke about the 4 minutes. She kept that alongside the other things she carried underneath, not for punishing herself with, but for keeping herself honest about what warnings were worth and what the cost of ignoring them could be. Scout died in the spring of 1906, on a Tuesday morning in April, on the same warm floor beside the masonry stove where he had spent the better part of 15 years. He had gone gray around his muzzle and moved carefully in his last months, but he had continued to position himself near whoever in the house needed him most. Cal built the marker himself, a piece of Douglas fir, smoothed with a draw knife, the letters cut carefully with a chisel. He was 20 years old and had been apprenticing as a builder for 2 years, and the letters were straight and even and properly spaced. He kept watch so we could sleep. 1891 to 1906. They buried him beside the cave entrance, in the shadow of the Douglas fir, in the ground that was just beginning to soften with the spring thaw. Nell stood with her hand on Cal's arm. Jonas stood beside Mae. Nobody said much. Some losses are large enough that words make them smaller rather than larger, and all of them understood this. Nell taught school for 31 years. Her favorite lesson involved a piece of limestone and a candle, and a demonstration of thermal mass that she had worked out herself from the principles her mother had explained to her when she was 9 years old, holding one end of a measuring rope against the far wall of a cave. She never lost the habit of starting with the question rather than the answer. Cal built houses. He had a particular specialty: structures for women who were starting over, widows mostly, women who had come into possession of a piece of land and a list of problems and not enough of anything else. He charged what they could afford, which was sometimes very little, and he made up the difference in other ways. When people asked him why, he said his mother had taught him that warmth was meant to be shared. Mae Sutton died in March of 1931 at the age of 71 in the house she had designed herself, the one with the stone floor in the kitchen and the masonry stove and the east-facing porch where the morning light came in long and gold before the rest of the day had decided what it would be. She died in the room where she had lived, with Jonas beside her, and Nell, and Cal, and their children in the house, and the stove working quietly the way it had always worked, without drama, without demand, holding the warmth she had put into it, and releasing it slowly into the room where she lay. Edmund Calder returned to the cave twice more after that December of 1905, once in the spring of 1906, when he brought two colleagues who did not believe his temperature readings, and once in the autumn of 1912, when he was finishing a paper on thermal anomalies in limestone formations and needed to verify his measurements one final time. Both times the cave held exactly what it had always held. He wrote in his final report, published in the Journal of the Geological Society in 1913, "The thermal stability of the Delward Formation is not anomalous. It is a function of mass, orientation, and the deliberate application of principles that the geological literature has documented for decades. That these principles were applied here in 1891 by a woman with $47 and 2 children to keep warm is not a geological finding. It is something else entirely." He had been right that it was impossible by any standard he had been taught. He had been wrong about why. It was not impossible. It was simply built by someone who had been taught to ask a different question. Not, how do I make more heat? But, where is the heat going? The limestone ridge, 3 miles west of Delward, still stands. The Douglas fir are very old now, their trunks thick, their roots deep in the rock. The cave entrance is narrower than it was. The fir have grown close on both sides, their branches nearly touching above the opening. In winter, snow collects on the branches and falls in heavy clumps when the wind moves through, but the entrance stays clear. Inside, the room Mae built is still there, on the wooden frame beside the stove, at a height of about 2 feet from the floor. 2 sets of marks remain visible. The initials, OG, and a date, cut with a knife blade in the careful hand of a man who was not accustomed to carving letters and had taken his time anyway, and below them, in the unsteady hand of a 5-year-old with a nail, a horse with legs of different lengths and a head too large for its body, and one ear pointing up and the other pointing sideways. The stone never lies about what it keeps. If you are facing your own storm right now, if you are sitting in the cold and wondering whether what you have built is enough, remember her. Remember that the warmth you have already put into the walls around you is still there, still held, still waiting to be given back. The earth never lies about what it keeps, and neither does love.